Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Quantum Computing How-To, Executing a Successful Proof of Concept from Start to Finish, sponsored by Classiq. Before we begin, I do need to cover a few initial housekeeping items. On the left side of your screen is the Q&A. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can type your question into the Q&A box and submit them to our speakers. All questions will be saved, so if we don't get to answer you during the webinar, we may be able to follow up via email. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets that you can use. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the question mark help widget, and here you can find answers to common technical questions. A copy of today's slide deck is available for download in the related content widget. Towards the end of today's presentation, please complete the survey on your screen. It'll only take a minute to complete, and your feedback will be extremely helpful. An on-demand version of this webcast will be available for about one day after the event, and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier today. So with the housekeeping items out of the way, I'll now briefly introduce myself, our panelists, and the topic of today's webinar. My name is Sam Lucero, and I'm the Chief Analyst for Quantum Computing Research at Omdia, the research division of Informa Tech. Omdia has produced standalone reports on the quantum computing market since 2018, and this year is establishing an ongoing subscription research service to consolidate and expand this coverage. I'm very pleased to welcome Scott Buchholz from Deloitte Consulting and Yuval Boger from Classiq to today's webinar to share their experience and expertise on how adopters of quantum computing technology can implement a successful proof of concept. I'll ask Scott and Yuval to introduce themselves more fully in a bit, but first let me set the stage for today's conversation. So quantum computing is hitting an inflection point in terms of interest from players in many different industries and verticals. In 2021, Informa presented several webinars focused on the question of why quantum computing? That is, why should companies be interested in quantum computing technology? And I urge you to view these on-demand webinars at your convenience. Today, we want to focus more on the question of how do I get started? And so over the next hour, we're going to look at issues such as determining when the right time is to launch a quantum computing proof of concept, identifying the right challenges applicable to quantum computing technology, building out the potential use case framework, establishing a vendor selection process, and taking next steps. So again, welcome. I'll first ask a quick audience poll question to get us started. Then I'll ask Scott and Yuval to each introduce themselves and their companies. We'll then ask another quick level-setting poll question of the audience, and then we'll dive in and discuss those 4 points that I just mentioned. We'll certainly leave plenty of time at the end for our audience Q&A, so please do remember to send your questions through the On24 system, and we will answer as many as we can. So here's our first poll question. At what stage is your organization in exploring and adopting quantum computing technology? And I'll leave this up for a few seconds to start to collect answers. And this will help Scott and Yuval to level set, to tailor their remarks to the audience. So please do submit your answers. And let's see what we have found. Great. Okay. So the majority are learning about quantum but have not made any specific investments. So a very nice audience profile for today's conversation. With that, Scott, would you please introduce yourself and how Deloitte is active in the quantum computing market?
Absolutely. Thanks, Sam. It's great to be with all of you here today. So I'm Scott Buchholz. I have the privilege of leading our quantum computing efforts here at Deloitte as we look at what are the possibilities, what are the potential use cases, what might we be thinking about, and what should our clients and customers be thinking about as they look at the field of quantum computing. At Deloitte, we've actually been monitoring quantum computing for a number of years now. I also lead some of our emerging technology research reports. And if you go back a number of years, it's been something that we've been keeping an eye on and tracking. And it's at the point where it's starting to become far more interesting and far more exciting. It's less of sort of the thing that we geek out about because we get to talk about temperatures colder than outer space. And now increasingly something where we have conversations about what you might do with it, when you might think about it, and how you might engage with it. As for those who may not be familiar, Deloitte is a global consulting organization. We also provide tax and audit services. But in the quantum space, we have a group of colleagues around the world who are helping organizations like yours figure out what they might be doing in quantum computing, how to get engaged, what sorts of problems are tractable, everything from proofs of concepts to more advanced implementations, and seeing what's new and what's next and helping guide the journey. One of the things that I would say is when we think about the spectrum and the space of quantum computing, it tends to be fairly broad. So when we think about this, when we're working with our clients, there are sort of 3+1 series of use cases that we tend to think about. We think about things like artificial intelligence and machine learning. How can quantum computers today help with topics like optimization, machine learning? What are the sorts of problems that in the future are likely to be even more tractable to these kinds of solutions? What kinds of things should people be thinking about to get ready? Where should we be looking for problems that potentially could benefit from quantum acceleration, and so forth? Optimization and Monte Carlo modeling. Clearly, this is a little bit more largely in the financial services industry, at least in terms of Monte Carlo analysis. But basically, this is simulations and optimizations, logistics, supply chain management, portfolio optimization, looking at the spectrum of things, and the idea that the quantum computers of today and tomorrow may be able to demonstrate advantages, and thinking about how we get from where we are today to where we could be in the future. Chemistry and material science. As many of you may be aware, Feynman's original suggestion for using the use of a quantum computer was actually to simulate quantum systems. And so instead of doing lots of math to try to figure out what's going on in individual atoms and particles, we can use the quantum states in quantum computers. This is a heady area of research. Clearly, a lot of material science companies and chemical companies and pharmaceuticals are interested in trying to understand what is the art of the possible today relative to what can be done with classical computers, and where do we see that line going over time. If you think about it a little bit, there's this exponential nature of technology, and most of us tend to look at things including quantum computing and other exponential technologies, and assume that there's more of a straight line progression. And so it's kind of counterintuitive when we see the capabilities basically ramp up quickly. And so a lot of this is figuring out how to get ready as we're all collectively preparing for some of the up ramp in quantum. The last one in here is communication. This is really a little bit about the future of communication and security. I think many of you are probably familiar with the idea that quantum computers may, at some point in the next 5, 10, 15 years, depending on who you believe, be able to decrypt a lot of the encryption algorithms that we use today. How do we make sure that we are setting ourselves up to be able to communicate more securely? How do we make sure that we're securing data properly, and sort of what does that journey look like today and tomorrow? We have a number of resources that are available to get you started. One of the things that we've tried to do here at Deloitte is not actually explain all of the technology and the technical detail. The reason for that is because, first, we believe that there are a lot of really good technical references out in the world. If you're trying to understand the mechanics of how quantum computers work and other things. But the other reason is, when you think about it, I don't actually start explaining transistors and NP junctions in order to teach you how to use the latest version of your phone. What I really do is I tell you, here are the kinds of things you can use it for. We believe that in a lot of cases, what we need to do to empower all of you is help understand where are the places to look, what are the sorts of things to look for, and once you've figured those things out, it's much easier to bring the technical experts with the expertise in to actually connect with the problems and help move things forward. And so we have a lot of resources. They should be available in the links if you would like to download them, but certainly searching for Deloitte Quantum Computing will take you to a wealth of links that we are happy to work with today. Awesome. So I think that's sort of Deloitte in a nutshell. We're all easy to find, and we would love to have any discussions or answer any questions that you might have about getting involved in quantum computing, accelerating your journey, or otherwise understanding what's going on. So with that, Yuval, would you like to go?
Thank you very much, Scott. Thank you for this excellent introduction and, of course, for joining us in this webinar. My name is Yuval Boger. I'm Chief Marketing Officer of Classiq. I'm speaking to you all from our worldwide headquarters in Tel Aviv right now. Classiq is a software company. We make a software platform that helps people create quantum circuits, quantum software. So if you have a quantum problem that you want to solve, good chances are that you could make what we think is the best circuit using our platform. A little bit about the company. We're about 2 years old, raised close to $50 million in funding. So there's definitely a lot of interest in this field. We've been very fortunate to assemble a team of over 30 world-class men and women, software engineers and scientists to help us build this platform. And by the way, we are hiring for engineering, for sales and marketing position. So do visit our careers page if you're interested in getting into quantum. We've developed a number of patents that we believe are fundamental to developing high-quality software. And we've been working with customers in various continents, in various markets, both with enterprise customers and with academia, helping them get to where they want to get in their quantum journey. It seems that, to us at least, it seems that quantum computing is entering the mainstream. This is a survey that was done in December of last year, and it basically asked companies where they are in their quantum journey. Well, we see that about 30% of companies are in early or advanced adoption stages of quantum computing technologies, and another 40% are planning to adopt quantum computing for their company. I think many people believe and see that quantum computing holds transformational potential for their business. And just like companies that were perhaps late to get into the web or into AI, they stand to lose a tremendous amount. If they fall behind, they may never be able to catch up their competitors. The other thing that we see is that quantum is not focused on one particular industry. We see people from energy companies. We see people from logistics and transportation, from financial services, from pharmaceutical. Many companies, even some of those that you perhaps wouldn't expect normally, are looking into quantum. Now, they may not all have 50-person teams. They may have exploratory teams, 3, 4, 5, 10 people, just to gain an initial understanding and develop the internal competence of quantum, but they're looking into it. And so the issue that we see these companies running into is that on a good sense, computers are getting better. Computers have moved from 5 qubits to 10 qubits to 30 to 50 to 100, and soon they will be hundreds or thousands of qubits. And the software development mechanisms that were used to tackle toy problems on toy circuits, on toy computers, may not be relevant when you look at higher end computers in more complex circuits. It's almost like a 100-meter dash. Many people can run 100 meters in less than 20 seconds, and only a handful can run under 10 seconds, and almost no one, or practically no one, can run under 5 seconds. There's just a limit to human ability. And we think that with the increased power of quantum computers, there's going to be a limit to what people can manually do to create quantum circuits. So what we at Classiq are doing is we've developed a system where those who want to develop quantum software enter a high-level functional model. Essentially, they say, this is what we want the algorithm to do. And then we've baked a tremendous amount of expertise and smarts and experience and optimization into our platform to generate a circuit that makes the best use of the available resources of the computer that you want to run. So not only are we allowing our customers to create circuits quickly, not only are we allowing customers to make the maximum use of the compute resources that they have, but we allow people to do it that are not quantum information science PhDs. I have nothing against quantum information science PhDs. Many of my friends are. But if you want to create a finance algorithm or a chemistry algorithm or a supply chain algorithm, it's very difficult to find someone who's both an expert in supply chain and in quantum information. So being able to abstract, to hide the complexity, and to allow the designer to focus on what you want the algorithm to achieve and let us take care of the details is important. And as we speak with companies, they often want to do proof of concepts, which is what we'll be talking about here today. They want to say, okay, I think quantum is interesting. I believe that quantum is strategic, but let's find the use case. Let's find the problem that we are interested in tackling and build something out. So we'll develop the internal expertise so we can compare the results of a quantum circuit to a classical machine. And we've seen that to be successful, there are a couple of things that need to happen. You usually want to get executive support. Quantum is not expensive, but it's not free either. And if you want beyond the proof of concept to take it to the next step, it's good to build executive support at some stage. You want to be realistic. You're not going to crack RSA 2048 with quantum computers today, so set realistic goals. Think about what you will do after you achieve these goals. Understand the limits of today's computers, whether it's in number of qubits or noise or availability or cost and so on. And make sure that you involve domain experts, so it's not just quantum experts, but also chemistry or supply chain or finance expert. Think about how to run it. And of course, between Scott and myself, between Deloitte and Classiq, make sure that you have the right partner to guide you through the process and help you make the right decisions. So with that, Sam, we'd love to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Yuval. Thank you, Scott. And before we jump into the main part of our discussion today, and a very quick poll question to help Scott and Yuval understand the audience today. What potential challenges does your organization currently see in using QC technology? Please choose up to 3. So I've left this up for a couple of seconds, and I think now we will turn and see what results we achieved there. Okay, so this may be that everyone agrees on what the challenges are, or maybe I clicked that over a little bit too quickly. But in any case, immaturity, insufficient ROI, and won't be able to find use cases. So good sign in a very unscientific poll here that expense and complexity are not major perceived barriers. But in any case, let's now proceed with the discussion with Scott and Yuval. And I'll start by asking Yuval, how should companies determine if the time is right for them to initiate a quantum computing proof of concept?
Well, I think the first step is to understand whether quantum computing can help something for your company. What is the business goal? I mean, technology is fantastic, but it serves to solve a business problem. So if you were a transportation company, you could ask, could quantum computing help me reduce fuel costs or optimize resources? If you're a pharmaceutical company, you could ask, could quantum computing help me simulate molecules faster or better or more accurately? And once you've decided that there is a long-term business justification for quantum computing, people usually want to start experimenting on a small scale to see if the hype is true, to see if you can actually build and run a quantum circuit that solves a simple problem, maybe a problem that's simple enough that a classical computer can still solve it, not assume that you're looking for quantum advantage quite yet. And I think that the steps would be, first, identify that initial use case that you care about, and then define a reasonable scope, something that you would think you could complete in, say, 3 or 4 months, and try it out. As someone told me recently, quantum computing is not a capital expense. You don't have to buy a computer. It's really an operating expense. You allocate a few people and you buy a little bit of cloud time. So it's not super expensive to try this out. And on the flip side, it could be super expensive not to try this out if you end up being at a big competitive disadvantage.
Great. Scott, a slightly different spin on the question. Why should a company launch or conversely not launch a proof of concept now?
I think about this, Sam, a little bit like I think about insurance. Some of this is really organizational risk tolerance. If you say to some organizations, is it worth spending a little bit of money today to get up to speed on something that could be game-changing in the future? Some organizations will look at that and say, that's absolutely something worth doing, even if I get no, perhaps incredibly material benefit today. I'll gain some learning that helps me accelerate the journey, and it will be easier for me to keep pace with what's going on, as opposed to trying to run really fast to catch up. On the flip side, some organizations believe in just waiting things out. I think it depends a lot on the space that you're in and the industry you're in. We see industries where people are doing things like battery design. We see industries where people drug discovery and design. We see financial services, particularly those more in the trading space. We see folks who have supply chain problems and other things. A lot of them are starting to get involved and starting to look at this. If you think about, I'm a big fan of sort of looking at history to try to figure out what the future might be. If you think back a little bit to the history of machine learning and how some organizations invested early, even when the technology was very nascent, they were able to build sustainable capability and get out in front. And they're now able to do much more quickly than many of the rest of us. It's quite possible that quantum computing could go on a similar journey. And therefore, like I said, to some degree, it's an insurance question. It's an insurance problem. There may or may not be near-term return on investment, or there might be. But in either case, one doesn't typically look at insurance as something that's going to make you money. You look at insurance as something that is potentially going to help you with a future situation that has a high probability of arising, or at least a decent probability of arising.
Right. And Yuval, can you expand on that a little bit? I mean, from your vantage point, how does this decision to launch, not launch proof of concept tend to vary between industries and use cases from what you've seen? Is there any common theme of which types of industries should start sooner, which can maybe perhaps afford to wait a little bit longer, that you've seen working across the industry?
Sure. So the certain quantum computing applications require hardware of a certain strength. So, for instance, the bigger the molecule is, you might need a bigger computer to simulate it. Machine learning applications might need more or less than financial services applications, and so on and so on. But the key markets that we see interest in quantum computing are indeed financial services, logistics, or in that matter, any optimization problem, chemistry, which could be pharmaceutical, it could be battery design, it could be a chemical company, and then quantum machine learning, because quantum computers are both able to encode information differently and more compactly than classical computer, as well as find additional connections or different links between data that may not be immediately evident in classical machines. I think that organizations usually go through, I need to understand a little bit of quantum computing. I need to look at my competitors or published papers. We often see a situation where, say, a financial services firm comes to us and say, I saw this paper by Goldman or by Merrill Lynch or this or that company. They are in my market. I would like to be able to do the same. I would like to run this algorithm or something like it on a quantum computer and then use that as a baseline to improve on the algorithm. So we certainly see a situation where people sort of look left and right and try to see what their competitors are doing, what the analysts like Omdia and others are saying. And it's not expensive to get into quantum computing these days. And so to Scott's point, relatively small investment to get started and potentially a big risk if you don't.
Maybe if I can just add one thing to what you've all said is the good news as well is you don't have to know the use case that you want to solve before you approach organizations like Deloitte and Classiq. We are more than happy to work with organizations to go through the selection process. In fact, most of our proof of concept engagements start with some version of down selection of use cases that are more important, more valuable, more interesting. Part of that journey, if you take it with an organization who's helping guide you through that process, can be really helpful because they can actually help educate you about, here's a good place to look. Here might be a few places to maybe not start here, but put those off for a second or third phase. And just helping prioritize, I believe, is part of the education process that comes with a good proof of concept.
Sure. And how does a quantum computing proof of concept differ from proofs of concepts in more traditional enterprise IT domains?
Well, how about I start, Yuval? If you think about in typical enterprise IT domain, when we talk about proofs of concept, and I've done these for decades, you typically have a product, say it's an ERP system or a package to help you run your website or something, and you are looking to put it into production in short order. The proof of concept is there to actually de-risk the implementation because you are trying to validate that, in fact, the features that are promised, the marketing material that is put out there actually conforms to the requirements or meets your requirements and helps you think about how that's going to work when it's in your production environment. In most cases today, people are not putting quantum computers into production workflows. And if they are, just to be clear, I think most people's mental model of production is a transaction flow. The technology, the state of the technology today doesn't lend itself to being in the middle of your web page transaction flow and other sorts of things. It is better suited to the applications that perhaps sit off to the side, like training your machine learning model, as opposed to running it in production. It might be figuring out where to focus, as opposed to executing that in the moment. And so when we're looking around, when we're looking at problems, when we're thinking about what are the outcomes tend to be more learning, understanding, better appreciation, next steps, thinking about the journey over the next couple of years, as opposed to, and now I'm going to pull the trigger and, implement a new website. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You've both mentioned that the expense of a quantum computing proof of concept is more on the operational side than a large capital expenditure. Yuval, let me start with you. I mean, just in rough terms, how expensive is a quantum computing proof of concept project likely to be from what you've seen? And what are the cost drivers behind this?
Absolutely. So just to build first on Scott's point from earlier, one of the things that's different in quantum computing proof of concepts is that the goal is not necessarily to solve a business problem in the immediate term, but rather to gain competency. Organizations that we work with want to learn how to take a problem and how to decompose it and express it in a way that would work on a quantum computer. And then they want to execute it and see that the results make sense. And so the cost of a quantum computing proof of concept could be divided into 2 or 3 buckets. The first bucket could be if you work with an organization like Deloitte, figuring out what is the spectrum of possibilities, narrowing down the use cases to 2 or 3 candidates, and say, well, these are reasonable expectations for this proof of concept. The second bucket could be to work with a company like Classiq to give you the software licenses, to provide you with the training, and to work with you side by side so that it is you that is developing the application, but we help you do that. So the goal here is not complete outsourcing, oh, I need to paint my house, so I'll just pay someone to do it. The goal is for a company to learn how to run on their own. So this is, we'll put the training wheels, we'll teach you how to ride, and then we'll take them off. And the third part that's surprisingly inexpensive is actually the cloud time, the ability to run the code on quantum computers, typically on the cloud. And one reason that it's relatively inexpensive is that a lot of the cloud providers, whether it's Microsoft or AWS or Google or others, are happy to provide starter packages. And with us as well, that to say, well, if you want to use Azure or if you want to use AWS, we'll give you so and so much credit so you can get started really at no cost. So I think that an entire proof of concept would roughly, if I had to guess a number, to pick a number, and of course that varies a little bit on the scope and length, would be about $100,000 all included, give or take, to do a proof of concept.
Very good. And Scott, is $100,000 kind of the range you're seeing among your clients for a proof of concept?
In terms of orders of magnitude, I think, historically, if you look backwards a couple of years, Sam, you realize that the cost to get into quantum computing was in the millions of dollars range. And that was because organizations were trying to set up joint research agreements. Sort of today, we're seeing things measured more in the hundreds of thousands of dollars as people are trying to do proofs of concept and get engaged. And then obviously, depending on your ambitions, costs can go up from there. Certainly.
And, given the relatively low sort of entry fee to this, do companies tend to have a challenge with getting executive buy-in for a proof of concept? Or what do you see? And I'll start, Scott, with you. What do you see in terms of the challenge of executive buy-in to just get a proof of concept project launched?
I think it depends a great deal from one organization to the other. Some organizations, let me just give you an example of a spectrum. I have talked to pharmaceutical organizations who are all in from day one, and I've talked to other pharmaceutical organizations similar space, similar market, who are taking more of a wait and see approach, or a little bit more of a, working with third parties approach. And as a result, sometimes I come back to, it's a little bit of organizational risk appetite as a general rule. However, I think a lot of this is a matter of being able to clearly articulate a business goal to be solved. Most executives' eyes glaze over, in my experience, when we get in and start talking about entanglement and superposition and all the other mechanics of how this works. But they can get quite excited when we're talking about, hey, here's the future potential for what we're doing, and here's why this could be important for your organization. And therefore, I think in a lot of cases, it depends not so much on necessarily the problem, although that matters too. It really depends a lot on how you approach the executive sponsors in question to help them understand what's in it for the organization, to help them appropriately prioritize the initiative in the list of all of the other really great ideas that everybody has.
One of the things, if I may add to that, one of the fun parts of my job is I host a podcast, the Qubit Guys podcast, where I talk to industry leaders, whether it's analysts or customers or others. You can find it on Classiq.io, our website. And as I look back at some of the customers that I've interviewed, in many cases, it is a top-down decision. The CIO, CTO understands the strategic importance of quantum and then builds a team to start looking into it, find use cases, and create a proof of concept. But in some cases, we've seen it's better to ask forgiveness than permission approach, where someone at not the executive suite decides that quantum computing is very interesting, is very useful, runs some experiments, learns a little bit, whether it's their off hours or otherwise, and then comes to the executive suite with, say, here's what we've learned, here's what we can do, and now let's make this into a formal activity and try to get some understanding of what true business value and how soon we can get it.
Great. Okay. Let's shift gears a little bit here in the conversation. And, how should adopters identify what challenges they may have that are tractable to quantum computing technologies? What types of challenges do tend to fit well?
Well, Sam, I mean, in the most self-serving way, I would say phone a friend. This is, and maybe a little bit of context behind that remark. Quantum computing is substantively and dramatically different than what we think of as classical computing. So the way classical computing works is that we have chips, they do math very quickly, and if you actually peel back the covers of all of the computers we use today, what's essentially going on is a lot of math getting done really, 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 really fast. And that's actually the paradigm with which many of us approach computing and computation. And it's actually has lots of impacts on other things, but we tend to think of computers as very fast calculators. The challenge with quantum computers is they work differently. As it stands today, they have no memory, so they can't keep things around. They can't know that something just happened. In addition, they are basically fancy constraint optimizers. So what you're essentially doing when you build a quantum circuit is setting up a huge series of complicated constraints and then asking the quantum computer to almost instantaneously derive the right answer. And that's a very different paradigm. It's a very different way of thinking than sort of the way we think about calculators. And so I believe that there is a certain amount of learning that one can do on one's own, I believe that there is a certain amount that one can do and get started with. And I also believe that there is a point in this journey, given how different it is, when it's worth calling on folks who have experience to come give you some advice, if not help. And I say that as somebody who is doggedly self-deterministic in terms of learning. But even in this space, what I've found is phoning a friend, and we have a bunch of quantum researchers I pick up the phone and call when I have questions. It's been incredibly helpful because this is just different than the things that I've been doing for the past several decades.
And I think the road to the future starts with asking, what if? So if you assume that you have a problem that you're solving on a classical computer, and you could start saying, well, what if I could solve that problem in a fraction of the time? So for instance, if I'm running a shipping company and it takes me a full day to create an optimized shipping schedule, you might ask yourself, what would happen if I could do that within minutes? Maybe that allows me to react to weather conditions or strikes or so on. Maybe you have a system that balances a financial portfolio, and you can ask yourself, well, what if I could balance a portfolio that is 10 times or 100 times larger? What if I could make better risk assessment calculations? What if I could simulate a molecule in minutes and not days? And if the answer to that what if question excites you, and it not just excites you intellectually, but it excites you, yes, this could lead to a substantial benefit to my business, then that may be a candidate for quantum computer to explore. Quantum computers, of course, cannot do everything. We don't expect to be running Zoom meetings on quantum computers anytime soon. They're good for a specific set of problems. It could be optimization, it could be simulation, and others. But for those problems, there is a potential to either do much more in the same amount of time or do the same thing much quicker. And that could serve as a guide to selecting candidates for quantum computing proof of concept.
To that end, so Scott mentioned 4 key areas. And if we look at the first 3 that he mentioned, I'd like to ask both of you, which do you see your customers and clients most active in? AI, optimization, simulation. Where do you see the most actual commercial traction right now in terms of companies having interest in running a proof of concept against one of those 3? Yuval, do you want to go first?
Sure. We certainly see it in simulation and optimization. And optimization covers, of course, a very broad spectrum of problems. It could be traffic optimization, it could be resource optimization, it could be portfolio optimization, it could be solving graph problems, and so on and so on. We see less of it at the moment in the AI front, maybe just a function of very large data sets and more complex computational requirements that are not there yet for some of the quantum computers. But on the first 2 areas, we see a lot of commercial traction and interest.
Scott, does that pretty much match up with what you're seeing with your clients?
Yeah, yes, it is. It does. A lot. And in fact, I would be remiss, by the way, if I didn't say one of the optimization problems that's interesting, if people are curious, is that we actually currently have a quantum climate challenge that's being run by some of our colleagues in Germany. And what they're looking at is how do you optimize flight routes in airspace with lots of different considerations to help better support the environment by using less fuel and causing less environmental impacts. So if people are curious about optimization, that's certainly somewhere to look. There's also interest in terms of quantum chemistry as well and quantum material science. Although there have been a number of really interesting developments, it is a fiendishly complex space, and I would say we're still in relatively early days as people look at what the capabilities are, what might be possible, what's required to beat our best classical simulators, and a variety of other topics.
Great. Okay. Let's shift gears a little bit again. And I know we are 15 minutes away from the top of the hour. I do want to leave time for our audience to ask questions here. But Scott, what are the steps that should be involved in structuring a framework for evaluating potential use cases? I mean, I assume there's maybe a methodology involved that you found works particularly well, or a structured approach?
Yeah, a lot of it tends to be the sorts of things that Yuval was talking about earlier. So it's important to find a problem that has business value. It's important to find a problem where the business value of solving it more quickly is actually material to the business. It's important to find a problem that is tractable to quantum computers, particularly with the maturity of the machines and the technology that we have today. And it's important that whatever get decided be achievable within the constraints and the budget of the proof of concept. There are some really fascinating research questions that probably exceed most budgets. But if you think about it, that's sort of the set of factors that we look at with our clients as we approach, what are the use cases to consider? How do we filter them down? And then how do we pick one that makes sense to do as a first step in order to get the ball rolling in terms of understanding what are the limits of the technology and what would you want to do next and all those other sorts of things.
And Yuval, I'd imagine that in your experience, your approach tends to match up fairly well with what Scott just described. Do you have additional color?
It does, and I would add two things. One, as we briefly mentioned before, very often the goal is not just to solve a problem, but to develop the competency to do it yourself next time. So not complete outsourcing, but teach me how to use the platform, teach me how to think about quantum problems so that I could address the next problem on my own. The other thing that we see in the more successful organizations is that they want to build broad support across the organization. So they don't want to be in a situation where there are just 3 people who are quantum experts and can do various things. They want to be in a situation where other business units are excited about the potential of quantum, are identifying use cases, are perhaps funding some of these proof of concepts. So for instance, an example that I found very enlightening and very good was the work that was done by AXA, a European insurance company, where they have been slowly and methodically building support across hundreds of people in the organization on what quantum could deliver. They set the expectations correctly, that this is not going to be a game changer tomorrow, but that we have to plant the seeds today. So I think that the 2 points that I would add is, one, building the organizational support in a very broad sense in the education. People are naturally very interested to learn about quantum, so it's not difficult to get them excited. And 2, learning how to use the platforms yourself so that you could be self-sufficient.
Great. Okay. A last quick question from me before we turn to our audience Q&A. And I do see we received a number of questions from the audience, so thank you for that and keep those coming in. But last question for both of you. What vendor characteristics or vendor solution characteristics are, in your view, important to consider? So how should adopters and potential adopters structure their vendor selection process as they move to a proof of concept initiation? Scott, would you like to go first on that?
Sure. I think that there are a couple dimensions to this, right? So there is potentially a consulting dimension, there is potentially a software dimension and a hardware dimension. In some cases, there's some overlap in those. But in any event, in terms of advice and consulting services, it's important to pick a partner who has experience helping organizations like yours go on a similar journey, figure out what's going on, who is, and whom you are comfortable, to Yuval's point, is going to leave you better than they found you when they're done. In the software space, there are a number of options. Many of the options range from freely available software to commercial products like Classiq. As you can probably imagine, the more you're looking at a commercial product, the more capability and maturity tends to exist. And as a result, some of this is a budget discussion. Some of this is an existing relationship discussion. Some of this is sometimes determined by the platform discussion. So certain platforms have certain software constraints as well. The last one is the hardware discussion and the hardware dimension. In many cases, most organizations have an existing relationship with either one of the cloud providers, with IBM, with some other organization, and or with some of the startups in this space. And so in a lot of cases, part of it is also figuring out, do you have an existing relationship? For example, if you're a long-standing Amazon customer, to Yuval's point, they may be willing to give you credits to get you started. That might be a compelling reason to start there so that you can get started without too much fuss and then make a decision about where you go from there when you're done. But I would think about it in those three dimensions. They're all related. They're all important. But that's how I would personally suggest people think about it. Yuval?
And I would add three additional dimensions. The first thing is the expertise of the company that you work with. Are you using an open source product and you are left to tend for yourself? Or can you rely on experts that have done this many times, that understand the fundamentals, that know how to express real life problems in quantum terms? The second topic is IP. As quantum becomes more strategic, organizations want to protect their IP. And so the question becomes, who owns it? Who writes it? Who can improve it over time? To me, it sounds logical that an organization that thinks that quantum is important would want to own the IP that's generated from the work that they do and not have to license it or to find it in some other place one day. And the third dimension is the hardware portability. It is unclear today which quantum computing hardware vendors will be the winner in 5 years. Some of them will disappear. Some of them will get acquired. Some of them will run out of money. And some of them, of course, will thrive and succeed. So just like it is almost unthinkable to say, I'm writing a software program that only works on HP PCs, but will never work on Dell PCs, it's risky to build a strategy, whether from a software toolchain perspective or hardware perspective, that relies on one specific vendor, because that vendor may not be the best solution for you in a year or 2 years' time. So I think it's important to work with a vendor that allows you to work across multiple hardware platforms, to compare them, to get optimized results regardless of where you're running. So these are the three topics: expertise in the vendor, IP, and hardware portability.
Wonderful. Let's switch now to our audience Q&A. And we have about 6 minutes left. We have about 23 questions that have come in. I just want to emphasize again that we have a record of the questions. We will do our best to follow up via email if we don't get to your specific question today. But let's just dive into what we do have here. And the first question I'll ask to either Scott or Yuval. And for any of the audience questions, whoever wants to answer, please go ahead. Is mergers and acquisitions going to be a key development pattern? Let me scroll down here in the industry, given multiple startups have several different approaches to qubit technology. Some will leapfrog others and will generate more industry interest and business value. So in short, impact of M&A in ecosystem development.
Well, how's this? It's quite clear that if you look at emerging technologies and emerging spaces, once there's any sort of settling in the market, mergers and acquisitions start in earnest. We've seen a couple of them so far in the marketplace. The thing I would maybe counsel everybody to remember is that there are at least half a dozen different competing technologies to try to figure out how to build a future, more scalable, more reliable quantum computer. Trying to pick the current winner is a little bit like looking at a playground of kindergartners and trying to figure out which one will be the Nobel Prize winner. So I think we're going to, it's going to continue to be an exciting and dynamic space, and I'm looking forward to watching it over the next couple of years.
Yuval, did you want to add anything to that?
Scott is right. There will be mergers and acquisitions. That's why hardware portability is important. And the other thing that organizations need to decide at some point is whether they're looking for a monolithic full stack solution, meaning a single provider that does the hardware, the tool set, and the application, or whether they are opting for more of a best of breed solution where they don't have to take, sort of in the PC analogy, they don't have to take the word processor that comes from with their computer. They can choose something else. They could choose the graphic editing problem. They could use the microphone that they prefer, and so on and so on. And especially in a dynamic market where new approaches, new vendors, new ideas come all the time, I think organizations would do well to preserve the flexibility to switch as the conditions change.
Great. Okay. The next question, what are the feedback that you receive from your clients who have been trying some sort of quantum computing in their businesses, in particular regarding ROI? I guess the question would be, so people have launched these proof of concept projects, is there any common theme to the results people are seeing? Yuval, do you want to go first with that?
Someone told me that the half of success in life is expectation management. So if the expectation going into the proof of concept is that we will construct a problem using classic quantum computers and be able to compare the results to classical solutions, that we will learn how to use a tool chain or a platform so that we could continue to develop and enhance, and we would get a better understanding of what the opportunities and limitations of quantum computing are. If these are the requirements, if these are the expectations, then the proof of concepts, in our opinion and our experience, have been fantastically successful. If the expectation is we will put this into production tomorrow morning and beat the next hedge fund because we're going to be able to do something that they don't do today, these to me would be unrealistic expectations and are setting up the proof of concept to fail. This, unfortunately or fortunately, is a marathon, not a sprint. You're not going to get to a fantastic ROI in a month's time, but you have to start running if you want to finish the race.
How's this? I would agree with everything you've all said. The thing that I would also remind people is the state of quantum computers today is a lot like the state of classical computers in the 1960s. They fill rooms, they tend to be finicky, they require a lot of very specialized expertise. If you're trying to compare a computer from the 60s from a computer of today, there's really no comparison. And so Now, that doesn't mean that those computers from the quantum computers of today aren't on a trajectory where they may be able to do things cheaper, faster, and better than some of our technology in the future. But you have to start with the right set of expectations. And the right set of expectations is really, to Yuval's point, this is a learning journey and a marathon. If people walk in expecting a traditional classical sprint, they're probably going to be disappointed. So expectations management is incredibly important.
Great. Well, we are past time officially. I want to thank Scott and Yuval for a fantastic discussion. I want to thank all of you for spending some time with us today discussing quantum computing. Again, the recording of this discussion will be available in about a day. The slides are available for download. And thank you very much. I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. I will let Scott and Yuval make any last remarks they would like to.
Well, thanks everybody for the time and attention. Thanks also for the opportunity to be here. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to follow up with us at Deloitte. We're easy to find, we're happy to help, and we look forward to working with all of you.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Sam. It's been a pleasure. At Classiq, we love to learn, but we also love to teach. And we'll be very happy to talk to you about what realistic expectations are and show you the path to creating quantum that truly works for you.
Wonderful. Thank you all again. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.